Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Jason Day, and I welcomed Greg Atkinson to the podcast this week. Greg is the founder of Worship Impressions and the First Impressions Conference. He's an author, leadership coach, consultant, and member of the Forbes Coaching Council. Greg has worked with churches of all stages and sizes, including some of the largest and fastest growing churches in the country, and he is passionate about helping churches welcome people through hospitality ministries. In this episode, Greg and I discuss the challenges and opportunities of first impression ministries in our current physical and digital church world. We talk about the importance of communicating the why behind hospitality, and Greg shares some simple ideas your church can implement to engage newcomers. Many great insights that you can put into practice at your church, so please join me in my conversation with Greg Atkinson. Greg, welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. It's so good to have you with us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Greg, your passion in ministry is hospitality and first impressions. You know, the idea of making people feel welcomed to the church, engaging with people as they walk through the doors or as they join, a service online. And in our current world, due to the COVID crisis, there are all kinds of challenges, and there are also many opportunities, and you're going to help us by addressing some of those today. But before we move in that direction, Greg, can you talk to us a bit about why hospitality ministry is so vital?
Yeah, in a lot of my speaking and writing, I talk about it being a biblical mandate that, all throughout Scripture, we are told to welcome the stranger. Some translations say to welcome the newcomer, to practice and show hospitality. And this is from Old Testament to New Testament. From Old Testament, Leviticus, welcome the stranger, to Hebrews, do not neglect to show hospitality. Jesus himself said, I was a stranger and you welcomed me in, that same language of welcoming the stranger. And so if you look at Timothy and Titus, the qualifications of an elder, just to be a pastor, one of the qualifications is to be hospitable. So it seems to me that God takes hospitality pretty seriously, and it's a true mark of a Christ follower.
Yeah, and Greg, you work with churches all across the country here in the U.S. on this specifically. And as you said, you've written a lot, you speak at a lot of conferences, you host your own conference that focuses on this specifically. I'm just curious, as you work with churches, on kind of the scale of, let's say, ministry priorities, where do you find most churches are placing hospitality and first impressions?
Man, that's a good question. I've never been asked that. Yeah, it's good. So I would say for the average church across the board, it's pretty low. I started the First Impressions Conference and a weekend worship and guest services, First Impressions focused Facebook group to raise awareness. And my stated goal from the very beginning, my not hidden agenda, was that it would raise the importance and elevate the importance of this position for senior pastors, so that a lot of my network being lead pastors and senior pastors, that as they come across my Facebook group and my work and my writing and my books and the podcast and the conference, that they would see a need to staff for this, because most churches don't. But my hope is that my legacy, when it's all said and done, 20 years from now, kind of like we can remember a day where church communications at the local church was a church secretary that created the bulletin, and that was pretty much it. You had a secretary who created a bulletin each week and printed that off. Whereas now, tons of churches have church communication directors. And so my hope is that down the road, churches will have first impressions directors or guest services directors, and that we will be able to look back and say, there was a day where churches didn't staff for this. And, it could be a volunteer position, could be part-time, could be full-time. The churches that I consult with, they have full-time staff because I work with large churches. But what I will say is those that do staff for it and those that do take it seriously, the common denominator is they are fast-growing churches. And so the churches that I work with always make your outreach magazine. I love checking out the Outreach magazine largest church list and fastest growing church list because I sit there and count how many churches I've worked with. And I even have pictures of them on my business website of where they rank on the outreach list. But what I've found and I don't think it's a coincidence, I think it's just connecting dots. These churches that staff for first impressions and take it seriously and are hungry to reach guests and to reach the lost and to reach the unchurched and to reach their community, they grow. And it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. They grow because they're being very intentional. But I would say by far, most churches don't staff for that. And so that's kind of what my work is to raise awareness and to encourage pastors to see it as important.
Yeah, that's good, Greg. And as you mentioned, the vast majority of churches across the country aren't mega churches. We know that, right? Mega churches make a very, very, very small percentage of churches. So really the normal church is a much smaller, kind of community church. And yet the first impressions, hospitality, guest services ministry is important for churches of any size. Can you talk a little bit about what does that look like for a smaller church? And we're going to get into kind of the digital world and the physical world, in-person world in a moment because of everything that we've faced in 2020. But I just want to encourage churches of average size that aren't making those big lists as to what can they do just kind of simply, or how can they make this an emphasis even if they don't have, the budget or the funding to staff someone in that particular position?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we both know, the average church in North America is 200 people or less. I'm a part of a inner city church plant of about 50 people. If it was a really packed day, we would have 60. And we have a first impressions director who I coach and mentor and oversee, and they've read my book, and I have invested in them. I don't lead it at my own church. I just I pour into various staff, whether it be children's or worship or first impressions, and then encourage the pastor and help him. But the church is a small church. However, we see the importance of it. What I will say, sometimes I like to reverse engineer, and that is to look at a very large church. So when I do my First Impressions conference, and we're coming up on the fourth one, each year we have heard from very large church staff, giga church staff that lead large First Impressions ministries of thousands of volunteers. Because I think if you reverse engineer and rewind it back and say, okay, so they have somebody over this and this and this and this and this, how can we do this in our setting? I'd rather look at, let's see it as large as it can get, and then rewind it back and see how we do it in our context and how it would flesh out in a smaller community. But last year at our First Impressions conference, we heard from Elevation Church and we heard from Eagle Brook Church. Both are in the top 10 largest churches in the country. And in talking with them, and this is in person, face to face, me walking and talking with them in person, both Elevation and Eagle Brook in Minneapolis I said, when you launch a new campus, because they're multi-site, when you launch a new campus, what staff do you start out with? And both started out with guest services directors. They would have a children's person, a worship person, a campus pastor, and guest services. It's that important. And so I look at reverse engineering and thinking, well, if these large churches that have obviously doing something right to have grown so quickly and exponentially and have such a major footprint in their region, if we can learn from them, what are they doing well, and what is it that they're doing that is causing them to see such growth and you could say success, as far as reaching their community. Well, when they start a campus, they staff for first impressions, for guest services. And so how we took that back and reverse engineered it at my small church plant of 50 people, we said we're going to have a volunteer over first impressions, and we printed up greeter t-shirts, black t-shirts that say hello. And we have people outside that welcome you, and we have parking lot signs that we got from companies like Outreach that when you drive down the driveway going towards the church building, there's signs, yard signs and flags and banners and all of that, because we wanted to invest in that first impression and to make it a welcoming experience.
Yeah, that's awesome, and it's so important to see that a church of any size, you can do something in this area, and the importance, and I would say even in many ways when you're thinking of a church plant or a small church that's looking at trying to revitalize and re-engage with the community, if you have if you're making the efforts to connect and reach new people, then when they walk onto your campus or they walk into your church for the first time, you definitely want to have a welcoming experience, because oftentimes people are coming, from maybe no background of church as they walk through the doors, and it can be disorienting. So I mean, every church, as you've mentioned, needs to be prayerfully considering how this is a part of the ministry they do, especially if they're wanting to reach new people, right?
Right. I always say that church guests are fearful, skeptical, and anxious. They're fearful, they're anxious, they're a little nervous, they're worried, and they're skeptical. What do they want from me? Is this a cult? Do they just want my money? They have a lot of nerves. And so Andy Stanley has done a lot of great writing in books like Deep and Wide, where he talks about removing obstacles and barriers and anything that would stand in the way of somebody encountering the living God. And so for us to break down walls and barriers and remove distractions so that this fearful, anxious, skeptical guest can have a God experience and meet their Creator is such a great opportunity. I am celebrating my 26th year in ministry. I started in 1994, and I have served as a worship leader, worship pastor. I've served as a technical director and producer, and I've served as a campus pastor overseeing 2 multi-site churches, and have seen all throughout everything it takes to pull off a Sunday morning, from worship to production to campus pastor and hosting. And what I have learned over these 26 years is it's been said over and over and over again. Some people say 7 minutes, some people say 10 minutes, but if you're gracious and let's say it's 10 minutes, somewhere in the first 10 minutes, people make up their mind whether or not they're going to come back. That's long before I've stood up to lead worship. It's long, long, long before the pastor stood up to preach the sermon. And so when you realize how important a first impression is, and there's a lot of writing out there and studies that show that people actually make up their mind about somebody and make a first impression in milliseconds. It's like the flapping of a hummingbird wing. Milliseconds, they make up their mind. But in the first 10 minutes, my friend Mark Waltz in his book, First Impressions, years ago said that somewhere between the parking lot and the children's ministry check-in, they're making up their mind, and they need to know they matter to us before they hear they matter to God. When they get in the service and they hear the message and they hear the good news of the gospel, they're going to find out they matter to God, but they need to know they matter to us first in those first 10 minutes. And so Tom Rainer, wrote a book a couple years ago on guest services and becoming a welcoming church. And he did a study where he interviewed guests of churches that had left. And it was a large Lifeway research study trying to find out why these guests had left the church. And they said that once they got past the parking lot and the greeters and the ushers and they sat down in the auditorium, nobody talked to them. Nobody came up and welcomed them, that they just sat there lonely and in silence waiting for the service to begin. And it didn't feel friendly and genuine and authentic once they had got past the professional greeters. So it's everybody together. It's not just your first impressions team, it's your congregation. And that's why so many churches, which I wrote about in my new book that we did with Outreach and ChurchLeaders.com, the Hospitality Handbook, I have a chapter on section hosts. And that's where you just kind of own your section and realize if there's somebody new sitting in your section that you've never seen before, so that you can go and reach out to them and strike up a conversation with them.
Yeah, that's good. So important. Now, Greg, I want to kind of shift a little bit, because one of the big topics, that's an understatement, that we've been wrestling with is this entire COVID crisis and its impact on the world as a whole, but specifically its impact on the church and how we are doing ministry, and the challenges, the opportunities that it has presented to the church. And the COVID crisis has meant that many churches have been meeting online, right? And many churches made that shift whenever we cannot meet in person. And a lot of churches made that shift kind of at the same time. But now, as doors are being reopened, that's happening at a different rate depending on where you live in the country, here in the U.S. or around the world, where you live, what the restrictions are, those types of things. So there's not just like a flip a switch and everyone's, back into church. And in fact, many studies have been done over the recent weeks and recent months as churches are reopening, just to find out like how many people are actually stepping through the doors, coming to in-person gatherings. And most of those studies that we've seen, show somewhere between 30 to 40% of people are actually coming to the in-person gatherings.
Right.
So I want to talk a little bit, because I'm sure this is kind of a pressing question for many pastors, and again, churches of all sizes. Churches that never did any online ministry before began streaming. Many began streaming their worship gatherings, and so there's this. Churches are wrestling through this idea of, well, we have some people in person, some people online. What does that mean for churches as they think about first impressions?
Well, now we always have people watching us through the lens of a camera. I have done a lot of webinars recently to try to help churches as they think through reopening and reentry. And one of the things I talk about is my friend Jeff Reed talks about physical and digital, and we're in this phygital world now. And I did a talk for a friend of mine's Church Online Summit. It was a global conference on online church. And I talked about, when that day comes when you can gather back together and you're so excited and and it's only going to be 30%, like you said, of your congregation that shows up. That's what study after study after study and survey has shown. It's only about 30% of the people that actually come back. But, and then Tom Rainer yesterday sent out an email saying that going forward, he is predicting that 20% of the pre-COVID attendance will never come back. So for whatever you were, if you were a church of 500 or a church of 1,000 or a church of 200, Tom Rainer said 20% will never come back when this is all over. And so we have to start living in this physical world of recognizing that people are going to gather online. And so I said, when you stand up in front of your congregation and you're so excited to see them and you say, "Good morning, it's so good to see you," you want to add, and for those of you tuning in online, we are so glad you're choosing to worship with us. And always, look at the camera and welcome them and acknowledge them. It's that avatar concept from the movie Avatar. I see you. And, little practical things like introducing yourself. When you have a global audience and you have people turning in from all over, I see way too much, and I've seen this in my travels over the years as a secret shopper, where a pastor will just stand up and start speaking, and he never introduces himself. And I'm sure guests are thinking, And I have thought that many times over the years in consulting. Is this a guest speaker? Is this a student pastor? Is this a teaching pastor? Is this the executive pastor? Or is this the lead pastor? And so to stand up and say, hey, my name's Greg Atkinson. I'm the lead pastor here. I want to welcome you here. And just kind of tell them who you are before you dive in. But with the reality, my home church, we've had quite the experience. I'm not going back for a long time. The last time I was in church physically, I was consulting in Baltimore, March 7th and 8th that weekend. And then things where I am in the Carolinas opened up a little bit quicker in the South, and our church started meeting back. Out of our church plan of 50, only 12 people came back. And I was watching online, and then a few weeks later, the senior pastor, his wife, his son, and his cousin all got COVID, and they had to shut back down. His wife is still very sick. She's been to the ER twice, and she just can't shake it, and is struggling to recover. But and I've seen that, over being an admin, I have 2 Facebook groups that comprise about 20,000 people. And in the 2 Facebook groups where I can get a pulse and see what's happening around the country and around the world, I have seen church after church after church that opened up and then shut back down because they had a COVID outbreak. And so I say that to say, not in a negative way, but to say you're going to always need to rely on your online campus, whether it be the 70% of people that aren't coming back when you're meeting in person, or if you have to shut down and go back exclusively online again, or if you still have not been able to open up and you've been online this whole time. You want to always focus on the online campus as well and include them. And Life Church, through their open resources, has put out some great resources with online chat hosts and online pastor job descriptions. And they have a lot of free resources that help staff equip and educate people that are leading online campuses. And it's a good way for your volunteers to get involved. If you used to have greeters and ushers and you're not meeting on Sunday, to have them be involved in the chat and to be an online host. But it's the world we're in now, physical and digital.
Yeah, and Greg, let's dig in a little bit on kind of the practical, when it comes to first impressions online. What are some great ways that you've seen churches ministering to those people who are joining them, purely on the digital platform?
Yeah, a couple things I mentioned, in passing, the avatar concept, I see you, to recognize them, to acknowledge them, to welcome them. 2, to introduce yourself. 3, I would use multiple hosts, multiple faces online. I was watching J.D. Greer's church, the Summit Church in the Raleigh-Durham area, and they are a multi-site church. And so throughout the entire morning experience online, they had several of their campus pastors do a welcome or an announcement or a scripture reading. And so I was seeing all these different faces besides just the lead pastor. If you hear the same voice for too long, people start to tune out. And our attention spans online are a lot shorter. And so if you can mix up who's on camera and who's speaking and who's sharing and who's doing announcements and who's hosting and who's doing a welcome and who's doing the response, if you can mix that up. That week that I watched the Summit Church with J.D. Greer, he broke his message up into 3 parts, and he preached part 1 and then they sang a song, and he preached part 2 and they sang a song. He preached part 3 and they sang a song. And so he was very intentional to break it up. He was in a hallway at a bistro table. He wasn't in a large empty auditorium that would feel weird. And so he was in a small, intimate setting. I've seen guys in their living room. I saw Brian Houston from Hillsong in his living room. I saw Jensen Franklin in his living room. And so just trying to be real and authentic and genuine and opening people your doors of your home and letting them come in. A lot of churches are going to microsites or house churches or watch parties where they get together in small groups and watch the online experience. And so anything you can do to increase engagement. People like Carrie Nieuwhof and Andy Stanley have been saying for years now, to not focus so much on attendance, but engagement. And what's interesting is, I was joking with somebody recently on a webinar. Back, even growing up for me in the 80s, just because somebody was in church sitting in a pew did not mean they were engaged. I mean, you could hear people snoring. You could hear people getting elbowed by their spouse saying, wake up, wake up. And so just because you're taking up a seat in the auditorium doesn't mean you're engaged. You could be sleeping through a service in person and fully awake and engaged online. And so online and in person doesn't mean one is more spiritual or one is more engaging than the other. We've always had people that were just pew warmers that sat there and took up a pew, but they were spaced out and they weren't paying attention. And so, with online, people have a little shorter attention span because they can get up and go cook a Pop-Tart, or they can go to the restroom, or they can go fix a drink or make coffee. And so how you structure that service is very important to keep their attention.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm wondering, Greg, if there are some ways that you see churches doing first impressions online, the online space, that aren't connected directly to like a weekend worship gathering. Are there other ways that churches are focusing on this idea of guest services in the digital realm, at other times throughout the week?
Yeah, Sunday morning and throughout the week, I see a lot of churches. I was looking at Chad the other day at Elevation and Alan George at Life Church. I watched numerous churches over the weekend, and they're both great chat online pastors that welcome people and are so personal and pastoral and relational and authentic and genuine. That translates in a first impressions world. Just being genuine and relatable, relational and approachable. I've always said the best tool we have in our tool belt is a smile. And so being able to see people welcome you. Something that we've done in the first impressions world for years is connection cards, where we want people to fill out a connection card so we can get their data, we can get their information, and we can follow up with them and help get them assimilated into the local church, help get them plugged in so they can take their next step and grow in spiritual maturity, whatever that next step may be. And so a lot of churches in this digital world are encouraging people to either text in to a number, whether it be a texting connection card or fill out an online connection card. I mentioned on another podcast, one thing I've seen that's worked well for a lot of churches is to have a digital connection card that lives on your homepage throughout the week. One thing that's different about this season is you don't have to have church Sunday morning at 11 a.m. You can have playback all throughout the week. And so I did a blog post months ago about how your church's homepage should change. We don't need to see directions to your campus anymore if we're not meeting in person. We do need to know when the next online experience is. And so rebuilding and restructuring your homepage to have a digital connection card and to have a countdown to when the next experience is. And there's a lot of great companies out there that are offering, and I think you guys have been doing it as well, that are offering ways for people to stream their service. But you can have a service on a Monday and a Tuesday and a Wednesday and a Thursday and a Friday. I mean, you can have playbacks all week. I was watching Andy Stanley's message from this past weekend, and he was saying, hey, we have a 7 a.m. service. If there's parents that want to get up early and drink coffee and watch worship before their kids wake up, he said, we start at 7 a.m. and then we have it every 2 hours throughout the day, all the way up until night. You don't have to play it just once on Sunday morning. That's one of the flexibilities we get through an online experience, is it doesn't have to be a certain time that we've always had. You can have multiple experiences throughout the week where it's whatever works best for the people that tune in.
Yeah, that's good. It's interesting that you mentioned that. My home church New Life, we have 7 different campuses, and pastors, all of our pastors, they preach on the same topic, but they all, preach a little bit differently. It's pretty cool. So what I have found during COVID is when we typically would go in person and listen to, the whoever was preaching at, our regular, the regular service that we attended. What we did, even this weekend, we've watched multiple sermons because they're all on the same topic. We're in right now. They're preaching through Revelation, and so we had the opportunity to listen to different pastors approach, the same text. And it's interesting because, like you said, there are these opportunities for us to even attend church in a way even more than maybe we have in the past, because it's kind of more, there's a higher awareness that, hey, you can listen to the sermon, throughout the week, or if there are different people on your staff, even if you're a smaller church and you have, the youth pastor and the children's pastor and then, the preaching pastor all kind of preaching on the same topic, but teaching in different ways, that could be three different opportunities to kind of hear, the same message in one week. And people just, we weren't thinking of doing that because, those were kind of 3 separate things, something for the kids, something for our teens, and then something for maybe the adults. And now there are these additional opportunities I think churches can take advantage of, and kind of putting things in front of people more regularly, and not just being, as you said, locked into, Sunday morning or whatever that may be. So definitely some opportunities there.
Yeah, well, I actually consulted with New Life years ago. Brady Boyd called me up and said, come do a secret shopper, and got to experience you guys. And it's a great church that I love, and have loved their worship for years. Love the worship there. But it's an amazing church. And one of the things I remember about Brady is him, they had like a meet the pastor area after the service, like a guest central, where he could talk and pray with people and interact with people after the service. And so love what you guys are doing there. That's something I always look for is the pastor available?
Yeah.
Can you meet with people and pray with people and greet people? And so love New Life.
That's awesome, brother. Greg, if a church as they've been listening to our conversation today, they're thinking, yeah, there are a lot of opportunities there for us in this area of ministry. What are some resources that I know you've written a lot, you've spent a lot of your life in ministry focusing in on this, helping to equip churches. What are some resources that you'd point them to that might be helpful for them and for their team?
My last 2 books were focused. I've written 4 books, but my last 2 were focused on first impressions and guest services. I wrote a book. If you find it on Amazon, it stands out because it's green and it's got a very bold look, but it's called Secrets of a Secret Shopper, where I was thinking about what we talked about earlier, that most churches in North America are 200 people or less. And even if they wanted to, they don't have the budget to bring in and fly in an outside consultant. So I was talking to my publisher, and I said, what if I just write about what I do when I do a secret shopper and tell them everything I look for? So instead of paying thousands of dollars to bring me in, they can pay $10 and buy the book and secret shop their own church. And so it's had a lot of success. I was just looking at its rankings in Amazon in the UK and Canada and Australia, but Secrets of a Secret Shopper has helped a lot of churches because you can kind of see how to look at your church with new eyes. And then I wrote my latest book a year ago through you guys with Outreach and ChurchLeaders.com. Wrote the Hospitality Ministry Handbook for Volunteers. And what's unique about that was it was written for something that you could give your volunteers at your church. You could say, hey, Bob, I think you'd be a great usher. Why don't you read this book? Or, hey, Jeff, you're a great greeter. If you want to go to the next level, read this book. And it's very, very accessible, very user-friendly, very practical, very quick, easy read. You could sit down and read it in one afternoon, but just a help and a tool. And so people go to ChurchLeaders.com and buy it in bulk to give to their team. And then a resource that I'm very proud of, we're getting ready in late fall this year, November, to do our 4th First Impressions Conference. And you could just check out firstimpressionsconference.com. We have 122 speakers, and great lineup. We have New York Times bestselling authors Rick Warren, Bob Goff, Mark Batterson. We have Carey Nieuwhof back. We have Nona Jones back. We have Earl McClellan back. So we brought back people from year one that were favorites of people, and then we have 100 new people that our audience has never heard before. But we're focusing on first impressions and guest services and church leadership in person and online. And then we waited a while to announce this year's conference because we wanted to kind of get a lay of the land and see what was happening in our world and in our country. And so we chose the theme, Navigating a New Season. What's getting thrown around a lot is new normal, next normal, new normal. And I was talking with a friend of mine who's a story brand certified guide and a copywriter. And he said, what do you think about instead of new normal, new season? He said, new season has a lot of biblical connotation of there's a lot of seasons in the Christian life and a lot of seasons in a church's ministry. And so we're going to be talking about everything that happens in this post-COVID, post-quarantine. Dr. Tom Rainer's speaking. He has a brand new book coming out, The Post-Quarantine Church. He's going to be speaking on that, but we're going to be talking about what we're living through right now in this COVID reality, navigating a new season. And so it's just firstimpressionsconference.com. But you can find me anywhere online at Greg Atkinson, gregatkinson.com, at Greg Atkinson on Twitter and Instagram. But and then we have 2 Facebook groups. One's called Weekend Worship and Guest Services, and one is called Church Assimilation and Next Steps. And in those Facebook groups, we talk Sunday every day. We talk about the weekend experience each and every day. And it's a great resource for people to share what they're doing at their church. And we're figuring it out together. There's no pandemic experts. There's none of us that have been through this before. One thing I would say kind of in closing is, when you train volunteers, and I talk about this in the hospitality handbook that I did with Outreach, when you train volunteers, you want to always start with the why. Simon Sinek had the famous TED Talk, Why, and he said people will do almost any what if they know their why. And so in training First Impressions team and training people to stand in a parking lot or greeters or ushers, you want to start with the why. And in this COVID season, when you're talking to your parking team and greeters and ushers of, hey, we need you not to stick your hand out and shake somebody's hand right now. We want to do like Craig Rochelle and Life Church talked about, a touchless experience. Hey, we need you to wear a mask because it's a way of loving our neighbor and protecting the vulnerable and keeping people safe and making them feel comfortable. And so always start with the why when you train people. And then set the expectations. Some of the things that we're talking about this year, or people are talking about doing that touchless experience, which means we don't pass an offering plate, or how do we do communion, and having a digital connection card and digital first-time guest gifts and digital bulletin. So we're going to hear this year's conference from a lot of church communications people that are going to talk about how to pull this off in this season.
Wow, that's excellent. Lots of great resources, and we will have links in the show notes for those resources that Greg had mentioned, for those of you who are listening, so you can check that out in the show notes. Greg, such a joy to have you with us. Thank you for all that you're doing, how you're helping champion this idea of first impressions, hospitality, guest services, and the leadership that you're bringing to the church. And this year, as we've said, has been a very, very different year, and we thank you for stepping in and helping churches do this both in person and online. So thank you for being with us, brother.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. Every week, as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. We hope you are finding value from the Church Leaders podcast, and if so, we would appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcast so they can benefit as well. Thank you in advance. And if you have any comments, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com or connect with me on Twitter. You can find this podcast as well as other great faith-based podcasts on the Faith Play app, available for both Apple and Android. So be sure to check out Faith Play. Until next time, this is Jason Day encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.